a room full of people leaned back and laughed. The full kind of laughter. The kind that fills a room and rolls off the walls till it sounds like twice the crowd. All of it pointed at a boy of 16, standing very still, with scarred hands and a thin coat, and nowhere left in the world to go. They were laughing because of what a dead man had left him. A swamp, black water and bent reeds on the far edge of nowhere. Land they swore was fit for nothing, not for crops, not for cattle, not even, they said, for a grave. And a thin woman leaned down close to his ear and told him so. The boy did not laugh, because somewhere out under that black water, under everything the whole town was too busy mocking to look at twice, something was waiting, and on the coldest night in living memory, it would change everything. The first night on that land, the boy did not sleep. He sat with his back against a broken wall, knees pulled up to his chest, and in his cold hands he held the only thing the town had given him, a folded deed, stiff and official and cold to the touch. A piece of paper that said, in the flat language of clerks, that a stretch of frozen swamp now belonged to a boy who had nothing else in all the world. The wind moved across the marsh the way water moves, slow, then sudden, then slow again. It searched out every gap in the ruined little shack and slipped inside as though someone had left the door open just for it. And the boy, 16 years old, with nothing but a thin coat and a few small coins, and a worn book he had carried for miles, looked down at that cold paper in the failing light and turned over the only question worth turning over. Why would a man he had never met, a man he had never once laid eyes on, leave him the very thing the whole town had pitied him for? That was the question. That was where it began. Let the story go back. Not far. Only far enough to understand how a boy ends up alone on a piece of ground that everyone in the world has already agreed is worthless. He had not always been alone. There had been a father once, a quiet man with rough, careful hands, who smelled of river water and wood smoke, and who did not say much, but who would rest one of those big hands on the back of the boy's neck sometimes, just for a moment, and that small weight had felt like the whole world holding still. And there had been a mother, a woman with a soft voice, who hummed low while she worked, who warmed her thin fingers over a low fire on the coldest nights, and who told the boy strange small things she had carried with her from people long gone. One of those things stayed with him longer than the rest. A marsh remembers the sun. She said it the way some people say a prayer, not to be understood, only to be kept. He did not understand it then. He was far too young to understand it. But he kept it anyway. He kept it the way a person keeps a smooth coin in a pocket, turning it over and over with the thumb without thinking until it stops being a coin at all and becomes simply part of the hand. Then the father was gone. The river took him, one cold spring, in the way that quiet rivers sometimes take quiet men. And the boy was very small, and the house grew very quiet, and the mother's humming grew thinner, like a fire that has begun to run out of wood. And not long after, in the gray dead heart of a hard winter, the mother was gone too. She had taken in washing to keep them fed. She had bent over steaming tubs in rooms that were never warm enough, and a cough had settled into her chest and would not leave. And one morning she simply did not wake. The boy had counted the weeks of that cough. He had counted them the way a child counts anything frightening, as if the counting might give him some power over it. It did not, and so the boy was passed along. That is the gentle way of saying it. Passed along, as though he were a thing, handed from one set of hands to the next, a tool that nobody much wanted, but that nobody could quite bring themselves to throw away. A house here, a house there. There was a family who kept him for a season because they had hauling that needed doing, and they had use for his back and no use at all for the rest of him. They fed him at the end of the table after the others, and they spoke about him in the third person while he sat right there as if he could not hear. There was a woman who took him in and then sent him off again because he read by candlelight after the others had gone to bed. She said, reading after dark let trouble into a house. She said a boy who wanted to know things was a boy who would come to no good. She did not say it unkindly, which was somehow worse. She said it the way a person reports the weather. Each time the boy was moved, he learned a little more. He learned how to make his face go still and smooth, so that no one could read what was behind it. He learned to keep his hands where people could see them, so that no one would wonder. He learned to take up the very smallest amount of room a body could take, and still be a body in a room. By the time he was 16, he had become very, very good at being almost invisible. And that was the boy who walked into a plain little room one cold morning to hear what a dead man had left behind. The room sat above the town's main building, the kind of plain wooden room where serious words are said to ordinary people. It had one window, floors that creaked underfoot, and on that particular morning, it had a crowd. People had come to listen. They always come to listen. In a small town, when there is a chance to watch someone be quietly reminded of their place, a heavy man from the general store stood near the back, his thick arms folded over his belly, his mouth already half curved, the way the mouths of certain men are always half ready to laugh at someone else. A woman in a fine coat stood near the front, a woman the boy did not know, who would matter later, though he had no way of knowing it then. She did not laugh. She watched him with a kind of careful softness, the way a person watches a small animal out in the cold. Her name was Ruth, though he would not learn that for some time. And close behind the boy, so close he could smell the starch in her dark dress, stood the matron, the thin woman who ran the place where children with no families were kept. Her name was Cora Vance. She had narrow shoulders and sharp elbows, polished smooth from years of leaning on a desk while she decided the futures of children who had no say in the matter at all. Her face had settled over the years into a permanent expression of mild disappointment, the way a face will settle, in time, into whatever it practices most. The will was read aloud, plain words, clear words, and the room did exactly the thing the boy had braced himself for, walking up the creaking stairs. It laughed, not a small laugh, not the polite kind that hides itself behind a cough, the full kind, the leaning back kind, the kind that fills a room and rolls off the walls until it sounds like twice as many people as are actually there. Because what the dead man had left the boy was a marsh, a low, wet, frozen stretch of ground on the far edge of nowhere. Black standing water, brown bent reeds, no timber worth the cutting, no soil worth the plowing, no house worth the taxing. The town had a name for that land. They had been saying it for years, the way small towns enjoy saying things, polishing the cruelty of it with use. They called it the drowning mattress. And the matron, Cora Vance, leaned down toward the boy, folded her thin hands one over the other, and said in a voice pitched carefully so that every soul in the room would catch it, "Even your dead kin could not leave you land fit for a grave." The room laughed again. The boy did not. He stood very still, the way he had long ago taught himself to stand, and he let the laughter wash over him and through him, and he kept his face exactly the way he kept his face. But something caught in him, because when the man's name was spoken aloud in that room, a sound came back to the boy from a long way off, his mother's voice, her thin fingers spread over a low fire. "A marsh remembers the sun." And the boy thought, in the small private place where he kept the things that were only his, maybe there is something out there that the laughing has never bothered to look at. He did not say it. Of course, he did not say it. He had learned a long time ago what becomes of a boy who says hopeful things in a room full of people who have already decided what he is. He simply took the folded deed they handed him. The matron passed it over the way a person hands a child a spoon that is too hot, quickly, at arm's length, as though she did not care to be standing too near whatever came next. And then the boy turned and walked out, and the laughter followed him down the creaking stairs and out into the cold. No one stopped him from leaving the town 2 days later. No one offered to walk with him. No one asked where he would sleep, or what he would eat, or whether a 16-year-old boy could survive a winter on a frozen marsh with no fire and no roof and no one. The woman in the fine coat, the one called Ruth, watched him go from a doorway, and her hand rose halfway, as if she might call out, and then it fell again, the way a hand will when a person tells themselves it is not their place. He carried very little, because there was very little to carry. A spare shirt, a tin cup, the worn book, a few small coins, and the folded deed tucked inside his coat, where it would stay dry. The road north was frozen hard for the first few miles, cut deep with the ruts of wagons, and he walked along the narrow ridges between them so he would not turn an ankle in the dark grooves. The houses thinned out as he went. Then the fences thinned out. Then the road itself seemed to lose heart. The deep wagon ruts softened into shallow scars. The scars faded into the kind of faint trail that deer make and then forget. And the trees, the last true trees he passed, stood near the edge of the water, thin and bare and leaning hard, as though they too had been trying for years to get away from this place and had only managed to come this far. Beyond them, the land opened up, flat, wet, endless, sky above, reeds below, and wind coming from every direction at once, because there was nothing at all left standing to stop it. He smelled the place before he saw it, cold iron and wet rot, and underneath it something sour, like old tea left in a pot the whole long winter through. The ground changed beneath his worn shoes. The hard frozen crust gave way to a softer surface that seemed to push back when he stepped on it, as though the earth itself were breathing, slow and deep, and did not appreciate the weight of a boy. The cold water found the holes in his shoes. And then he stopped walking, because he had arrived. The land looked exactly like a place where hope had come, a long time ago, to lie down and drown. Black water stood in patches between low brown mounds. The reeds lay bent flat by a wind that had clearly been blowing since before anyone bothered to give this county a name. There was not a single tree thicker than a broom handle, only a few crooked dark things, bare and stubborn, growing at angles that seemed to suggest they had given up halfway through the attempt. The pale sky reflected white off the standing water, and if a person squinted, it became almost impossible to say where the land ended and the air began. There was one structure, a small collapsed shack, leaning hard to one side, with one wall gone entirely, and the roof sagging in the middle like an old animal that had simply sat down in the snow and decided not to rise again. Inside it stood a rusted stove with its iron belly split clean open. He could see straight through the crack in it to the bare, cold ground beneath. When he stepped toward the doorway, frogs leapt off the threshold and vanished into the dark water without a sound. And the boy stood there in the failing light, and a terrible, simple thought arrived. Even the frogs do not wish to live here. Every single person who had laughed in that little room had been right. This was not land. This was a punishment, folded up inside a piece of paper and handed to a boy who had no power on earth to refuse it. He had walked a very long way. He had nothing at all to walk back to. And as the last of the gray light began to fail, a new fact settled over him slowly. The way real danger almost always arrives. Not with a shout, with a quiet. He had no firewood. Not very much. None. The thin trees were far too green to take a flame. The old shack wood had rotted soft. He broke handfuls of dead reeds from the brush and fed them into the split stove, and they smoked like wet hair and gave off less warmth than his own breath did. He crouched beside that failing little fire for the better part of an hour, and it never once rose higher than his ankle. That was the first night. The boy slept, or tried to sleep, beneath the half of the roof that still held its place, knees drawn up to his chest, coat buttoned to the very top, both arms wrapped around himself because there were no other arms left in the world to do it for him. The temperature dropped hard after the light was gone. Ice formed across the standing water and made small sounds in the blackness. Soft cracks and ticks, like someone out there stepping very carefully across the marsh, drawing nearer. He told himself it was only the cold. He told himself there was nothing out there in the dark but more dark. But a boy alone in the night believes a great many things he would never believe by day. He held the cold deed against his chest, less for hope than for habit, the way a person holds on to the only object in a strange, dark room. And he thought, before exhaustion finally took him, that this was the loneliest he had ever been in all his lonely life. He was wrong about that, as it turned out, because he had not yet found what the marsh was keeping for him. Morning came gray and slow and grudging. The boy woke stiff and hollow and cold all the way through to the center of himself, and he did the thing a body does when it has nothing else to do. He looked for something to burn. He searched the ruined shack inch by inch. He pulled at the fallen thatch. He pried at loose boards with his stiff fingers. And against the one wall still standing, half buried beneath a heap of collapsed roofing, he found a bench, a heavy thing, old dark wood, swollen and warped with the damp of many years. One of its legs was thicker than the other three. He kicked it, not out of cleverness, out of plain frustration, out of cold and hunger, and the simple animal anger of a boy who had been handed a swamp and a joke and one impossible freezing night, all in the same breath. And something inside the leg shifted. He went still. He knelt down in the cold. His fingers were so stiff he could barely make them obey him, but he made them obey anyway, prying at a warped board near the base of that thick leg until, with a small dry crack, it gave way. And inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, tied around with dark waxed cord, was a bundle about the size of a family book. His breath caught somewhere high in his chest. He cut the cord with the rusted knife he had pulled from the ashes of the stove the night before, and he peeled back the stiff cloth with hands that had begun now to shake, and not from the cold. Inside were notebooks, small ones, each no larger than his own spread hand. Their covers numbered one after another in a careful, slanting script. Their pages stiffened with age, but, when he turned them, still readable. Beside the notebooks lay an old, worn knife, its handle rubbed smooth by long decades of someone else's grip. A map, hand-drawn, folded into careful quarters, and an envelope. The boy's hand stopped over it. The paper was soft with age, and the ink upon it had faded to the soft brown color of old tea left too long in the pot. And on the front of it, in a small, tilted, careful hand, were a few words that made the boy lower himself slowly down onto the frozen ground, for Caleb, if they ever let him come. He read those words 4 times before the meaning of them truly reached him. If they ever let him come, not to my heir, not to whom it may concern, not the cold dead language of the deed folded inside his coat, to him, to the boy, by his name, written with the quiet, aching certainty that someone, somewhere, might one day try to keep him away. He pressed the envelope against his chest and bent forward over his own drawn-up knees, and for a long while he did not move at all, because a man he had never met, a man who had died out here alone in the cold, a man the whole town had called a fool, that man had sat in this very ruin with these notebooks and this worn knife and this careful map, and he had written a boy's name on an envelope, and he had wrapped it against the damp with his own hands, believing, against all the evidence the world had given him, that someday the boy would come. He had walked out of that laughing room with a cold deed in his coat, and the marsh had answered him with a letter. The boy's hands were truly shaking now. He did not open it yet. He could not. Some things must be approached slowly, the way a person approaches a wild thing that might still take fright and bolt. But he opened the first notebook instead. The light was weak and gray, coming down through the broken roof. He had no lamp, no oil, nothing at all to read by but the thin morning. So he held the little pages close to his face, and he read. The handwriting was small, tilted to one side, but steady. The hand of a man who knew exactly what he meant to say. And these, the boy understood at once, were not the ravings of a madman. They were the records of a man who had spent a very long time paying close, patient, stubborn attention to a piece of ground that no one else in the whole world would trouble to look at twice. The first notebook was a map, not of the surface of the marsh, of its depths. The man had pushed long poles down into the wet ground at careful intervals across the whole of the land, and he had written down how far each one sank before it struck something solid far below. He had measured. Season after season, year after year, alone he had measured. The western edge ran shallow. The center ran deep. And in one corner, near the single low rise that the man had marked as the only high ground, there lay a thick layer of something dense and black and very, very old, resting on a bed of pale clay. The boy did not yet understand what any of it was for, but he understood one thing. He understood it down in the center of his chest, in the cold, hollow place that had been there since the morning the laughing began. This was not the diary of a man who had lost his mind. This was the life's work of a man who had given everything he had to something, and who had wanted, more than anything else in the world, for one single person to come along and finish it. He read until the gray light finally failed him. Then he wrapped the notebooks back up carefully in their oiled cloth, because they were dry, and he had already learned out here, in one night and one morning, how rare and how precious a dry thing could be. He fed the split stove a few more reeds that would not burn. He pulled his thin coat tight around his thin frame. He lay down again beneath the half of the roof that held, and the wind came again, and the ice ticked again out in the black. But something had changed. He was still cold. He was still hungry, the deep ache of it now living in his belly. He was still, by every measure the town would ever use, a foolish boy alone in a ruin on a worthless swamp. But he was no longer alone in the way that wounds the deepest. And in his stiff hands, in place of the cold, official deed, he held the letter now. The one with his name written in faded ink by a man who had died waiting for him. He wanted to open it. He was afraid to open it. Both things at once. The way grief and hope so often arrive at the door together, holding hands. Because if he opened it, and it turned out to be nothing, if it was only a stranger's regret, or an apology, or worse still, simply empty, then he would be exactly as alone as the laughter had told him he was. And there would be no more keeping the small private hope warm against his chest. So he did not open it. Not that second night. He held it close instead, the way a person holds the last kind thing they believe they may ever be given, carefully, quietly, without quite letting themselves trust that it is real. The boy lay there in the dark, turning it over in his mind, the way his mother had once turned her thin hands above the fire, the way he himself had turned the smooth coin in his pocket through all the cold years of being passed along. A marsh remembers the sun. He understood now that it had never been only a story, not just a small thing his mother had murmured to warm herself on a bitter night. It had been a map, handed down, waiting, like everything else out here on this lonely ground, for someone at last willing to look beneath the surface of things. In the morning, he would open the letter. He knew that now, lying in the dark. He had found the courage for it somewhere in the long, cold hours, the way courage tends to come to a person, not all at once, in a great rush, but quietly, in pieces, while they are busy simply staying alive. He would read what the man had written to him, the man who had chosen him. And whatever those words turned out to say, the boy knew one thing for certain. He would not walk back to the town that had laughed him out the door. He would not return to the thin woman in the dark dress with her practiced face of disappointment. He would not be handed off again, passed along again, fed at the end of the table again, made small again. Whatever was buried under that black water, he was going to find out. He held the letter to his chest and he closed his eyes, and for the first time in a great many years, the boy who had taught himself so carefully to take up no space at all in the world allowed himself just a little to take up some, to want a thing, to hope for it. The wind kept moving across the marsh, slow, then sudden, then slow again. The ice kept singing its small cold songs out in the dark, and the land that everyone called the drowning mattress seemed to hold its breath, and hold its long-kept secret, and wait for the boy, who had, after all this time, and without ever once meaning to, finally come home to a place he had never been. The boy opened the letter in the gray light of morning. He did it the way a person steps onto thin ice, slowly, holding his breath, ready, somewhere in the back of himself, to be disappointed. He was not disappointed. The words were few. The hand was the same small, tilted, steady hand from the notebooks, and they reached into the boy and took hold of something that had been frozen for a very long time. The man wrote that he knew the boy might one day be told he had come from nothing. He wrote that the town would call this land cursed or worthless, or both, and that the boy should not believe them. And then he wrote the line that broke the boy open, right there on the cold floor of the ruined shack. What looks dead in summer? Maybe holding winter's fire. The boy read it once, then again, then a third time, his lips moving without sound. And then he bent forward over the little page, and he wept. Not the quiet kind of weeping, not the kind a boy learns to do without being seen. The other kind, the kind that bends a person double and pulls sounds out of them they did not know they carried. He wept because a man he had never met had spent a lifetime preparing something for him. He wept because that man had written his name on an envelope and wrapped it against the damp, year after year, believing the boy would someday come and find it. He wept because his mother had told him about the marsh, and he had thought it was just a thing she said to warm her hands by. And it turned out it had been a map all along. When he finally stopped, the light had grown a little stronger, and the boy wiped his face with the back of one scarred hand, and he looked at the notebooks spread out in front of him, and he said something out loud, not to anyone. There was no one. He said it to the shack, and to the notebooks, and to the frozen marsh waiting beyond the broken wall. All right, just that. One small word, but it was a beginning. The boy read for days after that. He read by the thin daylight, because he had no other light. He read until his eyes ached and the small, tilted letters began to swim. And slowly, page by page, the dead man's mind opened up to him like a country he was learning to walk across. The notebooks were not magic. That was the first thing the boy understood. There was no secret spell hidden in them, no buried treasure, no easy answer that would lift him out of the cold. There was only a man paying attention for a very long time to one small piece of the world. The man had studied the black layer deep beneath the marsh. He had cut into it. He had dried it. He had burned it. And he had discovered something the whole laughing town had never once thought to ask, that the dark, dense ground beneath the water was not dead at all. It was old plants, pressed down and held in the wet, airless dark for a span of time the boy could scarcely imagine. layer upon layer upon layer of summers that had happened long before anyone living had been born. And all that captured summer, all that old sunlight, locked away in the black, could be cut and dried and given back as fire, as warmth. The man had written it plainly in one of the middle notebooks. Dry it and it burns. Stack it thick and it holds the warmth in. The same dark ground gives you the fire, and the wall to keep the fire close. The boy sat very still when he read that, because he finally understood what his mother had meant. A marsh remembers the sun. It remembered all that buried light, all those vanished summers, waiting in the cold dark to be called back. The man had not been a fool, chasing madness in a swamp. He had been mining warmth out of a place everyone else saw only as a grave, and he had written it all down. For a boy he had never been allowed to meet. Knowing a thing and doing it, however, are two very different countries, and the distance between them, that first winter, very nearly killed the boy, because the marsh did not care what the notebook said. The cold came in hard and early. The standing water froze solid. The wind found every seam in the patched-up shack and laughed its way inside. And on the worst nights, the boy woke to frost forming on the wall beside his face. Food was the true enemy. He learned to trap badly with his stiff, split fingers. He learned to dig roots from the half-frozen ground until his stomach cramped against the strangeness of them. He grew thinner. He pulled his belt one notch tighter, and then, some weeks later, another. He tried to burn the wet black ground to keep warm before it had dried, and it only filled the little shack with a smoke so thick and sour that he had to crawl out into the snow on his hands and knees, coughing, his eyes streaming, just to find air. That was not a bad day out on the marsh. That was an ordinary one. His hands split open from reaching down into the cold water. The cracks bled, and the blood froze on his knuckles, and he learned that frozen blood is a surprisingly stubborn thing to wash away. And every night, alone in the dark, the cold whispered the same thing to him that it whispers to anyone it gets its fingers into. Give up. Lie down. It would be so much easier to stop. There came one night when the boy nearly listened. A hard, freezing rain had come through a gap in the roof and soaked his only blanket through. He lay there in the wet and the dark, shaking so hard his teeth knocked together, listening to the ice tick against the reeds. And he made a decision. In the morning, he would go back. He would walk the long frozen road back to the town. He would stand in front of the thin woman in the dark dress, and she would say something sharp and precise about swamps and dead grandfathers and foolish boys, and he would stand there and take it, and at least he would be warm. He got up before the light. His hands were so cold they hardly worked. He gathered the notebooks first, because some quiet, stubborn part of him wanted to wrap them up dry and safe for whoever might come after, even now. And as he tied the cord around the oiled cloth, one of the notebooks slipped from his fingers and fell open on the cold floor. It fell open to a page near the middle, and the boy, kneeling there in the half-dark, ready to leave, looked down at it. It was a list, page after page, in that small tilted hand, the same word repeated again and again. Failed, failed wall, failed seal, Failed fire. The chimney drew the smoke back inside. The roof gave way in the wind. The bricks crumbled before they dried. A whole notebook filled with failure. The boy stared at it, and then he saw the thing that stopped him cold. After every single failure, there was a measurement. The wall cracked at the joint, the man had written, and then beside it, exactly where and exactly why and exactly what to try next time. The mortar went on too wet. Use it drier. Make the seam narrower. The chimney pulled the smoke back down. The throat is too wide. Cut it by half. The roof failed in the wind. The pitch is too shallow. Make it steeper. Tie it heavier. Failure after failure after failure. And after each one, not despair. A note. A correction. A reason to try again. And then, near the bottom of one page, in slightly heavier ink, as though the man had pressed down harder when he wrote it, a failed wall still teaches, if a man is humble enough to measure it. The boy knelt there on the cold floor for a long time. The freezing rain dripped through the roof. His blanket lay soaked behind him. The road to the warm town waited outside the broken door. And the boy slowly, carefully untied the cord. He set the notebooks back beneath the bench. He did not leave. That was the turning. Though the boy himself did not know it yet. He did not become warm that morning, or fed, or strong. The marsh did not suddenly grow kind, but something inside him had shifted, the way the deep black ground had shifted under the man's poles all those years ago. Something solid had been struck, far down, beneath the cold water of his fear. He understood now that the man in the notebooks had not been clever, not the way the town used the word. He had not been gifted with some secret the boy lacked. He had simply refused to stop measuring. He had treated every failure as a teacher and not a sentence. He had failed and failed and failed and written it all down and tried again the next morning. And if a grown man could fail that many times and keep going, then perhaps a boy could fail a few times more and keep going too. The land kept him alive after that. Barely, by the narrowest margin. A traveling man came through that frozen country and traded the boy a sack of grain for 2 hours of mending his sled. The grain was old and half spoiled, but it was food, and the boy measured it out in handfuls and made it last far longer than it had any right to last. He found berries frozen hard beneath the reeds near the water's edge. He learned which roots his stomach could bear. He learned to keep his small fire of dried reeds going just long enough to thaw his hands before sleep. He did not thrive. No one would have called it thriving. But when the ground finally began to soften, and the ice pulled back at last from the edge of the marsh, the boy was still there. He had survived the winter. He had not yet cut a single brick. He had not built a single wall. He had only lasted. But lasting, it turned out, was its own kind of beginning. The boy was on his knees at the water's edge the first time the old man's voice came out of nowhere. He had been trying, clumsily, to cut into the black layer the way the notebooks described, reaching down into the cold water, feeling for the change in the ground, sawing at it with the worn knife. He had managed to free one heavy, dripping, crooked block of the dark stuff, and he was holding it up, dripping, turning it in the gray light, when a voice spoke behind him. "You'll lose half of those before they dry, cutting them that thick on one end." The boy spun around, the knife up, his heart slamming. An old man stood at the edge of the ruined shack. He was tall and thin and stooped, leaning his weight on a worn willow cane. His coat was too big for him, the way clothes become too big for a person who has been steadily growing smaller. His face was brown and deeply creased like a walnut shell, like a thing the weather had been working on for a long, long while. And his hands. The boy noticed them because of what they would later teach him. Big hands, knuckled, scarred, curved slightly inward, even at rest, as though they were still holding tools that were no longer there. The old man raised both of those big hands, palms open, slow. "Easy now," he said. "There's nothing out here worth taking. I'd know. I've looked." "Who are you?" the boy asked. The old man did not answer right away. He was looking past the boy, at the water, at the single crooked block of dark ground dripping in the boy's hand, at the broken shack and the bench inside it, and the corner of oiled cloth just visible beneath. Something moved across the old man's creased face, something old and tender and sore. "I knew the man who used to work this ground," he said at last. "A long time back. I helped him haul the first stones for a hearth he never got to finish." The boy lowered the knife. "They said he was mad," the boy said quietly. The old man let out a slow breath that was almost a laugh, but had no cruelty in it at all. "They did say that, yes." He leaned on his cane and looked out over the bent reeds. "They were wrong. He wasn't mad, boy." A pause. "He was just early." The old man's name was Amos. He had seen the boy's smoke from a distance, he said, drifting up off the marsh. Not wood smoke, a different color, a different weight in the cold air. He had not smelled that particular smoke in a great many years, not since the man who used to work this ground had stopped being alive to make it. And it had drawn him, the way a far-off bell can draw a man who has not stepped inside a church in longer than he cares to count. Amos did not ask the boy whether he wanted help. He simply set down his cane against the wall of the shack, and he walked, slow and stooped, to the place where the boy had laid out a few of his sad, crooked blocks to dry. He picked one up. He turned it in his big, scarred hands. He frowned at it, the way a man frowns at something he respects too much to lie about. "Too thick here," he said, tapping one end. "It'll dry on the outside and stay wet in the middle, and then it'll crack on you the first cold night, right when you need it most." He set it down, gently. "And your racks sit too low to the ground. The damp comes up into them. Lift them. The wind has to get underneath, or it'll take you twice as long to dry a single brick." The boy stood there, watching those big hands, and he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt the simple, enormous relief of another human voice that was not laughing at him. He nearly sat down in the mud from the weight of it. But the boy was careful. He had learned to be careful. So that first day, he watched more than he spoke. He watched the old man's hands, mostly, the way they trembled slightly when they hung empty at his sides, and the way they went perfectly still, steady as stone, the moment they took hold of a tool, or a brick, or a stone. Amos showed him things, but he did not do them for the boy. That was the first thing the boy noticed, and it mattered more than he understood at the time. The old man would show him how to angle the knife so the ground's own weight helped split the block free. And then he would hand the knife back and step away, and let the boy do it himself. Wrong at first, then a little less wrong, then right. He would show the boy how to feel for the change in the wet earth, the place where the loose upper layer gave way to the dense black layer beneath. And then he would fold his big hands and wait, and let the boy's own fingers learn it. "My hands already know this ground," Amos said once, when the boy looked up at him, hoping. "What good would it do you to have it living in mine?" So the boy learned, by doing, by failing, and measuring, and doing again, just as the man in the notebooks had. And slowly, between the two of them, the dead man's mind and the old man's hands, the boy began to learn how to wake the warmth out of the dark ground. It was several days before Amos told the boy why he had really come. They were sitting by the boy's small fire as the light went down. The old man had stayed later than usual, and the boy could see what the long days were costing him. The way he could not quite straighten his back, the cough that caught him in the mornings. The boy had not asked. He had learned long ago not to ask people why they were kind, in case the asking made them stop. But that evening, the old man spoke without being asked. He spoke of a woman he had loved, long ago. He said her name once, soft, and then he did not say it again. The way a person handles something too worn and too precious to keep turning over in the open. He told the boy that one bitter winter, while he had been away from home, the cold had come for her. Their house had been built of wood, good wood. Everyone trusted wood. But the chinking between the logs had cracked in a hard freeze, and the wind had come through the gaps the way water comes through a torn net, and by the time anyone thought to check on her, it was already too late. Amos said it plainly, without decoration, the way a man speaks of a thing he has carried so long that all its sharp edges have worn smooth against the inside of him. "Wood walls," he said, looking into the small fire. "Everyone trusts wood." A long pause. "Wood fails." The boy did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He understood now why the old man had stayed, why he had climbed onto stiff knees and walked out across a marsh for a stranger's boy. Why thick walls mattered to him the way few things in the world matter to anyone. It was not really about the boy. Not only. It was about a wall thick enough that the wind could never again come through it for someone he loved. "That's why 3 feet, the old man said quietly. "Not 2. The man who worked this ground and we argued about it once, long ago. He came around to 3 feet in the end. I like to think I helped him get there." He smiled, just barely. He was stubborn. Stubborn the way a river is stubborn. He didn't go around a thing. He went through it. Slowly. Then the old man looked up from the fire, and he looked at the boy, and something passed between them in the falling dark. "But understand me, son," Amos said. "This house, when it stands, it will be yours, not mine. I've already built the only wall I ever needed to build, and I built it too late." He reached out and tapped the boy once, gently, on the chest. "This one's yours." The boy did not sleep much that night. Not from cold this time. From something else. Something that felt almost like having a fire lit inside the chest, in a place that had been dark and shuttered for years. He had come to this marsh with nothing, less than nothing. A swamp and a joke and a few coins and a name on an envelope. And now, slowly, the marsh was giving things back. A dead man's mind in 16 small notebooks, an old man's hands and an old man's grief turned into patient teaching, and down beneath the black water, all that buried summer, waiting. The work was still brutal. He knew that. There were 1,000 bricks still to cut, and a winter coming that would not wait, and the boy's hands were still split, and his belly still often empty. But he was no longer doing it alone, and he was no longer doing it blind. The kindnesses began small after that, so small the boy almost missed them. One morning, walking the edge of his land, he found a little bundle left near the path. A few bent nails, a cracked but mendable kettle, a small sack of grain with no name and no note. He stood and looked at it for a long while. He did not know who had left it. He would not know for some time. He only knew that someone, somewhere, in a town that had laughed him out the door, had walked all the way out here in the cold, and left a quiet gift on the edge of a swamp, and slipped away again without waiting to be thanked. It was the woman in the fine coat, the one called Ruth, the one whose hand had risen halfway and then fallen the day he left. But the boy did not know that yet. He knew only that the bundle was there, that the world, which had seemed for so long to hold nothing for him at all, had quietly set down a kettle and some nails and a little grain. As if to say, without words, you are not as alone as they told you. He carried it all back to the shack. He used the nails. He mended the kettle. And that night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the boy ate something warm. The first brick that truly held was a thing the boy would remember for the rest of his days. It had dried for many long weeks on the lifted racks Amos had shown him to build, turned to face the wind the way the old man had taught. And when the boy picked it up at last and struck it against another, it did not crumble. It rang. A clean, hard sound, like knuckles knocked against dry oak. The boy held it up to his face. It smelled of earth and of distance and of cold, clear mornings. He shaved a thin curl from its edge with the worn knife, and he laid the curl in the broken stove, and he set a flame to it. It caught slowly. It blew at the edges, and then it steadied into a low, even orange burn that did not flicker, and did not spit, and did not go out. The boy held his scarred hands over it, and he felt heat, real heat, not the thin, ankle-high ghost of warmth that the dead reeds had given him all winter, the deep kind, the kind that sinks past the skin and into the bone, and stays there, and tells a cold body it is going to be all right. One thin shaving of the dark ground, burning longer and warmer than a whole armful of reeds. The boy sat beside the stove and watched it burn, and he whispered something, soft, almost a prayer, the same way his mother used to murmur over a low fire on a winter night. You were right, he said, to the notebooks, to the old man, to the dead man who had loved him before they ever met. You were right. Outside, the marsh stretched away under a pale sky, black water, bent reeds, the land everyone in the world had called a grave, and inside the ruined shack, a boy who had been passed along all his life, told he came from nothing, laughed out of a cold little room, held his hands over a fire made of buried summers, and for the first time he let himself believe that the dead man's promise might be true, that what looks dead in summer may indeed be holding winter's fire, that a worthless swamp might just be hiding a home, and that a boy the world had given up on might still, with two stubborn hands and a borrowed lesson and a great deal of patience, build something that would change everything. The fire burned on, and the boy, for once, was warm. The house began on the high ground. The boy chose the one rise on all his land where the black water never reached. A patch of solid earth, lifted just enough above the marsh to stay dry through the wet seasons. And when he pointed to it, the old man nodded slowly, the way a man nods at a thing already settled. Your grandfather would have chosen the same spot, Amos said. Build low. Build dry, build out of the wind's reach. He wrote that somewhere. I'd put money on it. He had. In the third notebook. The boy had read it so many times the page had gone soft at the corner. So that was where they began. First, the trenches. The old man would not let a single brick go down until they were cut. Shallow channels, carried away from the rise on three sides, so that when the snows melted, the water would run away from the house instead of gathering against it. Water is patient, Amos said, leaning his weight on his cane while the boy dug. More patient than you. More patient than me. And I've had a long while to practice. Give it one way in, and it will find it. Give it none at all, and it will go somewhere else and sulk. The boy dug until his back screamed and the old splits in his hands opened fresh. And then he dug a little more. Then came the stones, 2 courses deep for a dry sill so that the bricks would never have to sit in the damp. The old man chose every single stone himself. He turned them in his big scarred hands, slow and careful, rejecting most of them, keeping few. Flat on 2 sides, dense all the way through. No hidden crack that the heat might one day find and worry at, and split wide open on a bitter night. And then, at last, the walls. Brick by brick, they rose, 3 feet thick, just as the dead man had measured all those long years ago. Just as the old man had argued for, across a checkerboard, beside this same dark water, with a friend the boy had never been allowed to meet. An outer face of the dried dark blocks laid the way a mason lays stone. The joints staggered so that no crack could ever run straight through from one side to the other. A packed middle of reed and sedge to turn the creeping damp. An inner face of more blocks. And over all of it, smoothed on by hand, a skim of pale clay to seal the surface and hold the dust. Each block weighed about as much as a full water bucket. Each single course of the wall swallowed more than 60 of them. And the walls were meant to rise to the height of a tall man's reach, which meant course after course after course. Day after day after day. The boy cut. The boy carried. The boy stacked. The boy plastered. His hands moved past, blistering into something the boy did not have a word for. The skin of his palms grew thick and yellow and hard and split at the knuckles. And after a while, he simply stopped noticing the pain. The way a person stops hearing a clock that has been ticking in the same room for years. The old man could not lift much. His back would not bear it, and they both knew it, and neither of them ever said it aloud. There was a kindness in that silence. The boy had learned by then that there are some truths you carry for a person by refusing to name them. But the old man's eye, His eye was the truest tool on all that marsh. He would lower himself onto a stone and fold his big trembling hands in his lap and watch the boy set a brick. And then he would say, very quietly, "A finger to the left," or "That one's wet at the heart. Set it aside, son. It'll fail you in the cold." And he was always right. He could find the flaw in a brick the way other men can read the weather in the sky. The boy built the walls. The old man built the hearth. It took him many slow days. He chose every stone for it with his own hands, rejecting 9 for every one he kept. He fitted them so closely together that the boy could not slide the blade of a knife between the joints. And he built a shield of clay to stand between the flame and the dark walls behind it, because the very same dark ground that burned so well inside the stove would burn just as gladly inside a wall if ever a careless boy gave it the chance. "Make the door face away from the cold," the old man said when the time came. "Never toward it. The wind is a thief, son, and a thief dearly loves a door. So make it crawl to reach you." So they built a low entry on the sheltered side, a small tunnel a grown person had to stoop and bow their head to pass through. And slowly, on the high ground, above the black water, in the middle of the land, the whole town had called a grave. A house took shape. A strange house, a dark, low, humble house, built of the very ground that everyone had laughed at. The town began to notice. A few of them came out to look. They stood at a careful distance at the very edge of the high ground, unwilling to set their boots down on the marsh itself, as though it might reach up and pull them under. Some shook their heads. Some muttered to one another behind their hands, and a few of them asked quietly, almost shamefully, whether the boy might trade them some of the dark, dried bricks. For they had heard, they said, that the bricks burned long and burned hot. The boy traded. He never once sold the secret of how it was done, and he gave his advice away free to anyone who asked it of him without a sneer. But he traded bricks for flour and for lamp oil and for a good pair of boots that did not let the cold water in. And among those who came out across the marsh to see was the woman in the fine coat. She came alone, one bright, hard morning. She stood at the edge of the rise and looked at the half-built walls for a long while without saying anything at all. The boy knew her, the woman who had watched him leave the town, the woman whose hand had risen halfway in the air and then fallen again, the day he walked away with the laughter at his back. "You left the kettle," the boy said. It was not a question. The woman, whose name was Ruth, colored faintly. "I didn't want to embarrass you," she said. "Or myself, I suppose. My husband keeps the store. He's a careful man. He wouldn't have approved of it." A pause. "I left it anyway." The boy did not know what to say to that. He had grown so used to cruelty that a plain, clumsy kindness left him standing there without any words at all. So he simply said, "Thank you." And the woman nodded and looked once more at the rising house of dark earth. And something crossed her face. Something that lived in the country between wonder and grief. "My boy is small," she said quietly, almost to herself now. "Our walls let the wind through on the bad nights. I lie awake and I listen to him cough, and there's nothing in the world I can do about it but listen." She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. The boy looked at her and then he looked at the thick, dark walls he had raised with his own 2 hands, and he understood something then that he had not quite understood before. What he was building out here on the worthless swamp was not only a house for one orphaned boy, it was, perhaps, a thing this whole frozen country might one day have need of. But not everyone came in kindness. There was a man named Harlan Boyd. He was the sort of man who carried a ledger the way certain men carry a holy book, always open, always ready to set down in ink exactly what another person owed. He wore a dark coat in every season of the year, and he had a way of looking at a piece of land that had nothing at all to do with the land, and everything to do with what could be wrung out of it. He rode out to the marsh one cold afternoon when the walls had risen to a man's waist. He did not climb down off his horse. He sat there at the edge of the high ground, looking down at the dark house, and his face was not angry, and it was not laughing either. It was doing arithmetic. "That'll burn," he said at last. "All that dried out swamp dirt, stacked up like a chimney, with a fire set down in the middle of it. One spark, boy. One. And you'll take half the county to the grave along with you." The old man was sitting on his stone beside the hearth. He raised his head slowly. "Show me the danger, Harlan," Amos said. His voice was mild, but there was old iron underneath the mildness. "Go on. Point at it for me. The trenches carry the water clear. The hearth has a clay shield, fitted tighter than your own conscience. So where, exactly, is this spark of yours going to make its home?" Boyd did not so much as glance at the old man. He kept his cold eyes fixed on the boy. "A ward boy doesn't hold land," he said. "He squats on it, until men of standing decide otherwise." He let that hang in the cold air a moment. "This ground owes back taxes, boy. Years upon years of them. Your madman grandfather never paid a cent, and dead men, as a rule, don't settle their debts." A thin, cold smile. "There's to be an auction. All the unpaid parcels in the county, sold off to whoever steps up to pay what's owed on them. And I do so enjoy paying what's owed on another man's land." He gathered up his reins. "You've until the auction to settle the debt, in full, and you won't manage it. A boy with 2 raw hands in a swamp does not lay his hands on that kind of money." The smile widened, just slightly. "So enjoy your little dirt house, boy, while it's still yours to enjoy." He turned the horse's head, "Because it won't be for very long," and he rode away into the cold, leaving the words behind him hanging in the air like a stone dropped, slow and heavy, straight into the middle of the boy's chest. That night, the boy could not sleep for the weight of it, because Boyd had been right about one thing, and the boy knew it. He had no money. He had bricks and a half-built house and a pair of split and bleeding hands and a dead man's 16 small notebooks. He did not have the kind of money it took to settle years of unpaid debt. And he was, in the cold, flat eyes of the law, exactly the thing that Boyd had called him. A boy with no family, no standing, no one anywhere to speak a single word for him. If a man with a ledger and the right friends in the right offices decided that the land ought to be his, there was very little in all the world that had been built to stop him. The old man found the boy sitting by the dying fire, staring at nothing at all. "I can see it on you," Amos said, lowering himself down slowly onto a stone. "That look, I've worn it a time or two myself." "He'll take it," the boy said. His voice was flat. The house, the land, all of it, after everything. The old man was quiet for a long while. Maybe, he said at last, maybe he'll try. He looked into the low coals. But you listen to me now, son. A man like Boyd does not ride all the way out to a swamp to threaten a boy over a fire risk that he himself does not believe in for one single minute. The boy looked up. What do you mean? The old man's creased face had gone grim in the dying firelight. I mean that he is afraid, Amos said. Not of the fire, of the house. He reached out and tapped the dark wall beside him once with a thick scarred knuckle. He's seen it work, same as all the rest of them have. And a man like Harlan Boyd doesn't ride out hungry for a worthless swamp boy. He rides out hungry for whatever the swamp has turned out to be worth. A long pause. The fire ticked between them. There's a thing I never told you, the old man went on, quieter now. About your grandfather. About how the whole town came to be calling him mad in the first place. The boy went very still. It wasn't only that he worked a swamp, Amos said. Folks will happily ignore a harmless old fool out in a bog. No. The talk got loud all of a sudden. It got loud right around the very time your grandfather started to get the thing working. Right around the time those dark bricks of his began to burn long and hot. And a man here, a man there, started to wonder out loud whether maybe, just maybe, the old fellow was onto something after all. The old man shook his head slowly. Strange, isn't it? How the word madman started up just exactly then. How fast it spread. How hard it stuck. Stuck so hard that the county let this land rot, and let the taxes pile up year on year, and let every living soul forget there was anything out here at all but a drowning mattress and a crazy old man who'd thrown his life away on it. He looked at the boy across the coals. Somebody wanted this ground cheap, son. Cheap enough to pick up for the bare price of the back taxes. Once the old man was safely dead and gone, and the boy was tucked away somewhere far off, where no one would ever think to look for him. A pause. Somebody who keeps a ledger and knows how to wait. The boy stared at him. Boyd, he said. I can't prove it, the old man said. It was long ago, and proof has a way of melting like spring ice, but I knew your grandfather, and not once in all those years did I ever believe that the man was mad. He laid his big hand flat against the dark wall again, gently, the way a person rests a hand on the shoulder of an old friend. I think a man with a ledger worked out that a swamp was worth a great deal more than people knew. And I think he made very, very sure that nobody else found it out until he could buy it for himself for next to nothing. The fire popped softly between them in the dark, and the boy understood then all the way down. The laughter that had followed him out of that cold little room had never been an accident at all. It had been planted a long time ago, carefully, by a man who wanted exactly what that laughter would one day let him take. The boy built faster after that. There was a clock running now, and he could feel every single tick of it in his chest. The auction was coming. He did not know the exact count of the days that were left to him, but he knew they were falling away, one after another, and he threw himself into the work like a man trying to outrun the dark. He cut bricks until his arms shook and his eyes blurred, and the world swam. He stacked them in the chill water under the low sun. He lifted and carried and set, course upon course, and the walls climbed steadily toward the sky. The roof poles went up. Driftwood hauled across the marsh on a sledge the old man had taught him how to build. The thatch went on, layered thick and tied down tight. And then the sabotage began. The first morning, the boy came out at dawn to find his drying racks overturned. Weeks of patient work scattered across the mud, soaking up the very wet they had needed so badly to be kept away from. The boy stood and looked at it for a long time, his jaw tight, his hands slowly closing into fists at his sides. He did not have weeks to lose. Not now. Not with the clock running. But he knelt down in the cold mud, and he gathered up what little could still be saved, and he set the racks back upright on their feet, and he began again. The second time was worse. A whole section of the lower wall, freshly plastered the day before, had been shoved inward, not by any wind, by hands. The smooth clay was smeared and gouged, the dark bricks knocked loose and scattered. A full day's labor undone in the dark while the boy slept, and in the soft ground all around it, the boy found the prints of a man's boots. He said nothing to anyone. There was no one to say it to who could do a thing about it. He simply rebuilt, and after that, he slept lighter, with the worn old knife close by his hand, and one ear always open to the dark. He never did catch the man at it, but he did not need to. He knew the way you know the smell of coming snow, whose hands were doing the work. A man with a ledger, and a great deal of patience, and a fear now growing in him by the day, that a boy he had been counting on all along to quietly fail was not failing. There were small lights in the dark of those hard weeks. The woman called Ruth came out again, and this time she brought her boy with her, a small, pale child who hid behind her skirts and stared up at the dark house with enormous eyes. She had also brought a basket, bread, still warm under a cloth, a bit of meat, a jar of something sweet. For the work, she said simply, setting it down on a stone. A body can't build on an empty belly. My mother always said so, and she was right about most things. And there was a woman who kept the small schoolhouse in the town, a thin, sharp-eyed woman named Clara Finch, with ink stains worn permanent into her fingers, and a habit of writing a thing down before she would say it aloud. She had heard the talk, she said, about the warm, dark house out on the marsh. And she did not, as a rule, hold with talk. She held with seeing things for herself. She spent a whole afternoon inside the half-finished walls. She measured them carefully with a length of string. She read 3 of the dead man's notebooks, slow, her sharp eyes moving down the small, tilted hand. And when at last she finished, she closed the cover and looked up at the boy. "This is not foolishness," she said. "This is patient watching, carried out over a great many years by a careful and a humble mind." A pause. "Your grandfather was not mad, child. He was only alone, and alone is a very hard thing to be believed from." She asked if she might write down what she had seen. The boy said yes. She asked if she might use the dead man's name when she did. And the boy said, quietly, that his name should come first. And so, slowly, quietly, the story of the warm house on the worthless swamp began to move through that frozen country, carried this time not by laughter, the way it had been before, but by a small handful of people who had bothered to come, and to look, and to see. The house was finished by the time the deep cold came down. It was not grand. It was small and dark and low, with its strange crawling entry and its thick dark walls and its perfectly fitted hearth. But it was warm. The boy lit the first true fire inside it on a bitter night. He banked it down low, the way the old man had shown him, and he pressed his palm flat against the inner wall, and felt warmth come slowly back into his hand, not the quick heat of the flame itself, the slow, deep, living warmth of 3 feet of dark earth that had spent a whole long season drinking in the wind and the thin sun, and now, at last, gave it all back. The boy stood there with his hand flat against the wall, and for the first time since he had walked out of that laughing room, he was not afraid of the winter, but he was afraid for everyone else, because the houses in the town were made of wood, and the old man's words sat heavy and cold in the bottom of him. Everyone trusts wood. Wood fails. It came on a night that began too warm. That was the thing the boy would carry with him forever afterward. The wrongness of it. A strange softness in the air, in the dead heart of the cold season, that had no business being there at all. Snow slid off the roof in heavy, wet sheets. The wind fell away to nothing, to a held and waiting stillness. And the boy stood outside the dark house and felt the hairs lift along his arms. He had read about this in the notebooks. The dead man had written of it once in a shaky and a careful hand. A warmth that comes out of its season is no gift. It is a held breath. It is the sky drawing back its hand before it brings it down. By the time the light failed, the sky over toward the cold quarter had turned a color the boy had never once seen in all his life. Not gray, not black. Something that lived between the two of them, low and heavy, and rolling along the flat ground like smoke off a fire. And then it came. It came with a sound like cloth being torn. Except the cloth was the whole of the sky, and the tearing did not stop, and did not stop, and did not stop. The wind struck so hard the boy felt the dark house take the blow, and hold, and not so much as shudder beneath it. The snow came sideways, so thick and so fast that he could not see his own drying racks, only a few short steps from the door. The cold dropped like something falling off a high shelf in the dark. The boy sealed the low entry tunnel. He fed the hearth. And the dark house did exactly the thing the dead man had promised all those years ago that it would do. 3 feet of dark earth held. The fire burned low and steady and sure. The wind screamed across the marsh and found nothing anywhere to take hold of. And the boy sat inside, warm, and listened to the storm hurl itself against the walls, and fail, and gather itself, and fail again. He could have stayed there, safe, warm, hidden away inside the thing he had built. He thought of the woman called Ruth, and of her small, pale boy, the one who coughed in the night, in a house with wooden walls that let the wind come through. And the boy stood up. The old man had made him string a rope weeks before, from the dark house all the way out across the marsh to the bend in the old road. The boy had thought it a foolish waste of good cord at the time. A rope is cheaper than a funeral, Amos had said, and that had been the whole of the argument. Now the boy took hold of that rope with both his hands, and he pulled open the entry, and he stepped out into the screaming white. The cold struck him like a wall coming down. The wind tried to lift him clean off his feet and carry him away. He could see nothing, nothing at all in any direction, but the rope clenched in his fists and the next single arm's length of it before it vanished into the white. He pulled himself along it, hand over hand, out toward the road. He found the woman first. She was on the road near the bend, half blind in the driving snow, and she was not alone. She had her small boy bundled up tight against her chest, and the child was far too quiet, and his lips had gone a color that frightened the boy badly, and the woman's own face was white and stiff with cold and terror both. Their house had failed her. The wind had come through the wooden walls, exactly the way the old man had always said the wind would. And she had done the only thing left in the world to do. She had wrapped her child up against her, and she had walked out into the heart of the storm, toward the one place in all that country that she believed might still be warm, the dark house on the worthless swamp. "This way!" the boy shouted, though the wind tore the words straight out of his mouth and flung them off into the dark. He pressed her hands hard onto the rope. "Hold this! Don't let go of it! Whatever happens, do not let go of the rope!" He took the child himself, against his own chest, inside his own coat, against the small warmth of his own body. And he led the woman back along the rope, hand over hand, one short step at a time, through the screaming white. The dark house swallowed them out of the storm, and inside, the warmth wrapped itself around them like something alive. The boy set the small boy down close by the wall, near the slow, even heat, and the woman dropped to her knees beside him. And the child stirred, and coughed, and slowly, slowly, the color began to come back into his small, still face. The woman looked up at the boy. She could not speak. Her mouth opened, and nothing came out of it at all. But the boy was already turning back toward the door, because if she had come, then others would be coming too. He went out again, and then again. He found the school teacher, the sharp-eyed woman named Clara Finch, coming down the rope through the white with a whole string of small children behind her, each one gripping tight to the coat of the child in front. She had gathered them up when the storm broke over the town, and she had remembered the boy's rope, and she had led them all out into the dark, toward the only warmth in all that country that she had ever trusted. The boy got them inside, every one. He counted them by the fire. He fed the hearth. He went out a third time, and it was on that third time, at the very edge of his land, that he found her, a figure swaying at the very edge of the high ground, barely upright, gray in the face, with ice frozen into her brows, moving in that stiff and broken way that people move when the cold has gotten deep down into their joints and means to stay there. It was a widow, an old, hard woman from the town, and the boy knew her. She was one of the houses that had sent him away long ago when he was very small. She had taken him in, and then she had put him out again, for the sin of reading by candlelight after the dark had come. She had closed her door against a child and handed him back to the cold, and not once looked behind her as she did it. And now she stood swaying at the edge of his land, with the storm killing her slowly. By inches, her own house failed and dark behind her. with nothing in all the world between her and death but a thin shawl. She saw the boy, and she knew him too. The boy watched the moment of it cross her frozen, ruined face. She could not even ask. Her cracked lips moved, and no sound came. And what was in her eyes was not a question at all. It was the simple, terrible certainty that she had no right left to ask him for anything. The boy thought of her door closing. He thought of the long walk back to the cold ward, a small child, alone in the dark. He thought of every house that had ever once looked at him and quietly decided he was not worth the trouble of keeping. And then he thought of a thing the old man had said to him once, low, beside the fire. Shut a person out in cold like this, son, and you don't punish them. You become them. The boy reached out, and he took the old widow's frozen arm. Come in, he said. He said it before she could ask. He said it before the part of him that kept the score could get a single word in. He said it because some things have to be decided fast, in the dark, before the colder parts of a person have time to speak. Come in, he said again, gently, and he closed her stiff hands around the rope, and he led her in, out of the killing storm, into the warm, dark house she had once declared was fit for nothing but a grave. By the time the worst of that long night had finally passed, more than 20 souls were gathered inside the boy's dark walls. Mothers and their children, the old widow, the school teacher with her string of small ones, people the boy knew by name, and people he had never once laid eyes on. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the warmth, packed close around the slow, steady, living fire. While outside, the storm hurled itself again and again against 3 feet of dark earth, and could not, for all its fury, find a single way in. The boy fed the hearth, 2 bricks every hour through the whole long night. He moved among the people, quiet, finding room, finding warmth for them, his hands black to the wrist with the dark fuel, his young face gray with a tiredness that went past the bone. He did not sit down, not once. The old man watched him from a stone in the corner, wrapped up in a blanket, his big scarred hands folded in his lap. And on his deeply creased old face, in the low firelight, there was something the boy was far too busy to notice. Pride. The deep, quiet, aching kind of pride that a man feels maybe once or twice in a whole life. Because the boy had not stayed safe and warm behind his good walls while that whole frozen country died in the dark, he had gone out into the very worst of it, again and again and again. He had carried a child against his own beating heart. He had led the lost in out of the dark by a length of rope. He had opened his own door wide to a woman who had once slammed hers shut in his small face. He had built a wall thick enough, at long last, to hold back the killing wind. And then he had spent the whole of that long, terrible night making certain that every single soul who needed it came safely inside. The storm screamed on against the dark house, and the dark house held. The fire burned low and steady and sure, made of buried summers, made of old sunlight, called back up out of the black ground by a dead man's patience and a boy's worn and bleeding hands. And inside those 3 thick walls, more than 20 people who had once laughed at him, or looked away from him, or quietly closed their doors against him, were warm, every last one of them, warm in a house built of the very swamp they had all agreed was worthless. warm on the hardest night that country had known in longer than the oldest among them could remember. Warm, because a boy that the whole world had given up on had refused, in the end, when it counted most, to give up on any one of them. Outside, the wind howled out its long defeat into the dark, and the boy, black-handed and bone-weary and just 16 years old, stood in the warm and crowded dark of the thing that he had built with nothing, and finally, quietly, let himself believe it. The dead man had been right all along. What had looked stead had been holding winter's fire the whole time. The storm broke at dawn. It did not end so much as exhaust itself. The screaming wind dropped by degrees into a long, low moan, and then into nothing at all. And when the first gray light came creeping across the marsh, it fell upon a world made strange and white and silent. Inside the dark house, the people stirred. They had slept, most of them, in the deep warmth, packed close together on the floor. Children curled against mothers. The old widow, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her color come back, her breath slow and even, and the air inside those 3 thick walls was still warm, still close, still holding the heat the way the dead man had promised all those years ago that it would. One by one, they woke, and one by one, they understood where they were. They had spent the worst night that country could remember inside a house built of the very swamp they had all called worthless. They had been carried and led and pulled in out of the dark by a boy they had laughed at or looked away from, or simply never bothered to think about at all. And they were alive. Every one of them was alive. They left in small groups. As the light grew stronger and the way home became passable, most of them said thank you. Some did not have the words and only pressed the boy's hand in both of theirs and looked at him and nodded and went. The woman called Ruth was among the last to go. She stood in the low entry with her small boy on her hip, the child rosy now and warm, and fussing the ordinary fussing of a child who is no longer in any danger at all. She looked at the boy for a long moment. He'd have died, she said softly. My boy, in the night, in our house. Her voice was steady, but only just. And you brought him in. You carried him in your own coat. The boy did not know what to say. He never did when it came to this. So Ruth said it for him. She reached out, and she rested her free hand on the boy's arm, the way his own mother might have done long ago. Whatever you need, she said. From here on, whatever it is, you come and ask. Do you hear me? And then she ducked her head and carried her child out into the white morning, toward the town. The old widow went last of all. She paused at the entry, leaning on the boy's offered arm, and she looked up at him, and her hard old face was working, fighting with itself. I put you out, she said at last. The words came out rough. When you were small, for nothing, for readin' by candle. She swallowed. And last night, you opened your door to me. The boy was quiet. Why? The widow said. It was not quite a question. Why would you do that? After. The boy thought about it. He thought about the old man's words. He thought about the long, cold road all those years ago. Because the cold doesn't ask who was kind first, he said. The widow looked at him a moment longer. Then she nodded, slow, and she went out into the snow, and the boy watched her go, a small, dark figure growing smaller against all that white. The town was not the same after that night, Word moved through it the way word always moves through a small place, quietly, through kitchens, and over fences, and after the gatherings on a cold day's end. But this time, the word was not laughter. This time, the word was, he saved them. The school teacher, the sharp-eyed woman named Clara Finch, had not been idle. She had her notebook, and her measurements, and the long, careful account of everything she had seen out on the marsh. And she did not keep it to herself. She told it to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen, how the dark house had held against the worst that country could throw at it, how 3 feet of swamp earth had kept more than 20 souls alive through a night that had cracked good wooden walls all across the valley, how a boy that the whole town had laughed out of a cold little room had walked out into the storm again and again and brought them in, and how a dead man, long called mad, had been the one to figure it all out, alone, and write it down. For a grandson he was never allowed to meet. People listened, and people remembered, and something in the town began, slowly, to turn. But the clock was still running. The boy had not forgotten it, even in the warmth of all that gratitude. The auction was coming. The debt was still owed. And a man with a ledger was still waiting, somewhere in the town, for a boy with no money to fail. Harlan Boyd had not given up. A man like Boyd does not give up on a thing he has wanted for as long as he had wanted that land. But Boyd had made one mistake. He had been so certain that the boy would fail, so certain that the swamp would swallow him the way it had swallowed his grandfather, that he had let his patience show. He had ridden out, and he had threatened, and he had let his cold arithmetic be seen. And there had been a witness to a great many of those years, an old man with a long memory who had loved the boy's grandfather, and who had never once believed the talk of madness. Amos went into the town. He went slow, on his bad knees, leaning on his cane the whole long way, and he did a thing he had not done in years. He sat down with people. He talked. He told them what he knew, and what he had seen, and what he had long suspected about how the word madman had started up all those years ago, just exactly when a swamp had started to look like it might be worth something. He could not prove all of it. He said so plainly, but he did not need to prove all of it. He only needed the town to start asking the question. And once a town like that one starts asking a question, it does not easily stop. It was the woman called Ruth who began it. She came to the boy one cold afternoon, and she was not alone. The school teacher was with her. And behind them, hanging back a little, awkward, was Ruth's husband, the careful man who kept the store, the one who would not have approved of a kettle left on a swamp path. He did not look quite so careful now. He looked at the boy, and he cleared his throat, and he held out a small, heavy pouch. "For the debt," he said gruffly. "On the land." The boy stared at it. "It's not all of it," Ruth said quickly. "It's not nearly all of it, but it's a start. And we've been talking, the women and I, and we mean to make up the rest." The boy did not understand at first. "You kept my boy alive," the storekeeper said, still gruff, still not quite meeting the boy's eyes. "And you'd have kept him alive whether I'd ever left you a kettle or not. A man pays what he owes." A pause. "And I owe you a son." It spread after that. The old widow gave what little she had. The school teacher gave. The bachelors from the livery, who had sheltered in the dark house through the storm, gave. Families the boy did not know by name, from homesteads he had never once visited, sent what they could spare, because they had all heard the story now, and they had all done the cold arithmetic of their own. A great many of them had a debt of their own to a boy on a swamp, a debt measured in living children, and in mornings they had very nearly not seen. A line of people came out across the marsh in those weeks, not to laugh this time, not to stare. They came to set down what they could on the high ground by the dark house, and to press the boy's hand, and to go. And when the day of the auction came at last, the debt was paid, all of it, in full. The boy stood in the cold little office above the town's main building, the same room, the same creaking floor, the same one window. But there was no laughter this time. He set the money down, and the clerk counted it and wrote in his great book, and it was done. The land was his, free and clear, and his own. The marsh that the whole town had called a grave belonged, beyond any man's reach now, to the boy who had refused to let it bury him. Harlan Boyd was in the room. He had come for the auction. He had come to pay the back taxes and take the land, the way he had planned for so very long. And he stood at the back in his dark coat, with his ledger under his arm, and he watched a boy with worn hands lay down the money and take away the thing he had wanted. His face did not move. But something behind it did. The boy looked at him on the way out. He did not gloat. He had learned somewhere in those hard, cold years that gloating is the small comfort of small men, and he wanted none of it. He simply looked at Boyd, and he said one quiet thing. "You were right about one thing," the boy said. "A ward boy doesn't hold land alone." A pause. "But it turns out he doesn't have to be alone." And he walked out. Boyd did not take the land. There was no land left to take. And the town, which had begun to ask its questions, did not soon forget what the asking had turned up. Boyd's ledger lost its power in that place. People who had once owed him began to look at him differently. Doors that had once opened for him began, quietly, to stay shut. A man who builds his whole life out of what other people owe him finds himself with very little in the end when the people stop paying. He left that country before the next season turned. The boy never learned where he went. The boy found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not much care. And then there was the matron. She came out to the marsh near the end of that cold season. The boy saw her coming from a long way off. A thin, upright figure in a dark dress, picking her careful way along the path toward the high ground. And something in him went still and cold, the way it always had, at the sight of her. Cora Vance, the woman who had leaned down toward him in that laughing room and told him that even his dead kin could not leave him land fit for a grave. She stopped at the edge of the high ground. She looked at the dark house for a long moment, and then she looked at the boy, and the boy saw that something in her had changed too. She looked smaller than he remembered. "I have heard," she said, "what happened here." Her voice was not sharp now. It was careful. "What you did. In the storm." The boy said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence costs nothing and gives nothing away. The matron stood there a moment longer, and then she did a thing the boy would never have expected of her, not in 100 years. She reached into her coat and she brought out a small bundle of letters. They were old, the paper soft and yellowed with handling, or perhaps only with age, tied around with a bit of faded ribbon. And the boy felt his heart stop in his chest, because he knew that small, tilted, careful hand. He would have known it anywhere. "These came to me," the matron said. Her voice had gone very quiet now. "A long time ago, after your mother died." She held them out, but the boy did not move to take them. He could not. "Your grandfather wrote them 3 times. He wrote and asked that the boy be sent to him. He said he had land and work, and that a child should not grow up among strangers when there was family still living that wanted him." The cold marsh wind moved between them. "What did you do with them?" the boy said. His own voice did not sound like his own. The matron's careful face crumpled just slightly at the edges, the way a thing crumbles when it has been held rigid for far too long. "I marked the man unfit," she said. "I marked the letters, and I put them in a drawer, and I sent you on to the next house, and the next." "Why?" the boy said. "Because the town called him mad," the matron said. "Because sending a child off to live on a swamp would have looked like foolishness, and worse, and I would have been the one blamed for it. Because it was easier." Her voice broke finally. "It was easier to close a drawer than to ride out to a bog and find out whether a man everyone laughed at had something to offer a boy that no one else wanted." The boy stood very still, and in the silence, all the years came back to him at once, every one of them, the 3 homes that had taken him in and put him out again, the end of the table, the slammed doors, the candle snuffed, the cold ward, and the long count of weeks of his mother's cough, the first winter on the marsh when he had nearly died, when he had nearly walked back and lain down in the warm and given up. All of it had not had to happen. There had been a man out here on this swamp with land and work and an envelope already written who had wanted him, who had asked for him 3 times, and a drawer had been closed. The boy felt the old cold rage rise up in him. He felt it the way the wind rises, sudden, off the flat ground. It would have been so easy to let it loose, so easy, and so deserved, and so very, very useless. He thought of the dead man's words. A failed wall still teaches, if a man is humble enough to measure it. He thought of the old widow, gray-faced at the edge of his land, and of the door he had opened to her anyway. And he understood, standing there in the cold, that there are some walls a person can spend a whole life living inside of, if they let themselves. Walls of grievance. Walls of what was owed and never paid. Walls every bit as cold, in the end, as the wind that comes through the wooden ones. He had built one good warm house out of this swamp. He did not want to spend the rest of his days living inside a cold one made of what had been done to him. So the boy took a breath, and he let the rage go. Not because it was not real. It was real. It was the realest thing in the world right then. He let it go because he wanted, more than he wanted, to be right, to be warm. "I forgive you," the boy said. The matron looked up at him, stunned. "Not because the letters don't matter," the boy said. His voice was steady now. "They matter. They matter more than almost anything. All those years, they didn't have to happen." He paused. "But I won't do it." "Do what?" the matron whispered. I won't live in the drawer you put me in, the boy said. You closed me in one once. I'm not going to close myself in another and stay there the rest of my life. I've spent too long being cold. The matron's eyes filled. She did not cry, exactly, but the hardness that had lived in her face for so many years simply went out of it, like a fire banked down for the last time. She held the letters out again, and this time the boy took them. He took them, and he held them against his chest, the way he had held that first letter, that first freezing night, when his name written in faded ink was the only kind thing in all the world. The matron turned to go. There is warmth here, she said at the edge of the high ground, not quite looking back. I felt it when I came near the walls. A pause. He'd have wanted you to know that. The man, that you finished it. And then she was gone. A small dark figure on the white path, growing smaller, going home. The boy stood alone on the high ground, with 3 letters from a dead man held against his heart, and for a long time, he did not move at all. He had been wanted. All along, he had been wanted. And somehow, knowing it now, late and crooked, and through a closed drawer and a hard road, it did not break him. It set him free. The old man left when the spring came. He did it quietly, the way he did most things. The boy came out one bright soft morning to find Amos standing by the hearth, his big scarred hands resting on the back of a chair, his cane hooked over one arm, and a small bundle at his feet. The boy understood before a word was said. You're going, the boy said. I am, the old man said. The boy felt something tighten in his chest. You don't have to, he said. There's room. There's warmth. You could stay. You could. I know I could, Amos said gently. He looked around the warm, dark house, slow, the way a man looks at a thing he is proud of. But you don't need me here anymore, son. And that is the whole point of the thing. He gestured with one big trembling hand at the walls. At the hearth he had built stone by careful stone. At the racks outside, and the dark bricks drying in the spring wind. I came out here, the old man said, because I lost someone once to a wall that failed, and I never could build the wall in time to save her. So I helped you build yours. His voice was rough now. And you built it. And then you did the thing I never got the chance to do. You filled it. With people. With everyone who needed it. He bent, slow, and picked up his bundle. There's nothing left for an old man to teach a boy who'd walk into a storm 3 times for people who once shut their doors on him. He smiled, just barely. You've got it now. All of it. The hands and the heart, both. And a man who keeps the warmth to himself has missed the whole point of building walls. He pressed something into the boy's hands. His tools. The worn draw knife. The plumb line. These are yours now, Amos said. Teach someone when the time comes. That's all I ask of you. Teach before you go hard. And then the old man, who had walked out of nowhere following the smell of smoke, and given a lost boy his hands and his grief and his patient teaching, walked away across the marsh, slow, leaning on his cane, into the soft, bright spring. The boy watched until he was out of sight, and then the boy went back inside, and he set the old man's tools by the hearth, where he could see them, and he did not feel alone. Because some people, the boy was learning, do not leave you when they go. They stay in the walls. They stay in the warmth. They stay in everything you build after. The seasons turned after that. And then they turned again. The story of the warm house on the worthless swamp did not stay on the swamp. The school teacher's careful account traveled. It was read and copied and passed along, the way good true things sometimes are. And people came to the marsh, from the town and from beyond it, to see the dark house and to learn. The boy taught them. He never sold the secret of it. He gave it away, free, to anyone who asked without a sneer, exactly the way he always had. He showed them how to find the dark layer beneath the water, how to cut it and dry it, and turn the racks to catch the wind, how to lay a wall 3 feet thick that the cold could not get through, how to build a hearth that would not fail. And the warm, dark houses began to rise, here and there, across that low country, on other wet pieces of ground that other men had called worthless, and in each of them, on the hard nights, families slept warm, who might not otherwise have slept at all. The dead man's notebooks were given a place of honor, set where people could see them in the schoolhouse under glass, with one dark brick beside them, and a small card in the schoolteacher's careful hand. It did not say much. It said only the dead man's name, and beneath it the words, "A lifetime of patient watching," and beneath that the boy's name, and the words, the proof. The boy grew, the way boys do. His shoulders broadened with the work. The splits in his hands healed into thick old scars, and then the scars became simply his hands, and he stopped thinking about them at all. He was no longer the boy that the town had laughed at. He was no longer passed along, or fed at the end of the table, or made small. He had a home that no one could take from him. He had a place where he belonged. He had, at long last, somewhere to stand. And then, one cold evening, near the end of a hard season, there came a knock at the low entry of the dark house. The man who had been the boy went to answer it. He was grown now, and steady and warm, and on the threshold, in the cold blue dusk, stood a child. A small thing, thin, with a face gone carefully still, and hands held where they could be seen, in the way of a child who has learned, far too young, to take up the very smallest amount of room a body can take, and still be a body. The child had been brought out to the marsh, the way such things happen. Brought out because there was nowhere else, and no one else. And that country has always had its share of children that nobody quite knew what to do with. The man looked down at the child on his threshold, and it was like looking through a window into a long time ago. He knew that stillness. He knew that careful, watchful face. He knew those hands, held out where they could be seen, so that no one would have any cause to wonder. He knew because he had once stood exactly there himself, cold, alone, handed off, certain, all the way down, that he had come from nothing, and was wanted by no one. The man knelt down, slow, so that his eyes were level with the child's. "Come in," he said, "out of the cold." And the child came in. The man sat the child by the hearth, close to the slow even warmth of 3 feet of dark earth, and gave the child something warm to eat, and a blanket, and quiet, and time. He did not ask the child anything. He had learned, long ago, that a frightened thing needs warmth first, and questions much, much later, if ever, He let the child get warm, and when the child had finally stopped shivering, when the color had come back, and the small shoulders had dropped from around the small ears, the man went to the place where he kept his most precious things. He took out a sheet of paper and a pen, and he wrote. He did not write much. He had learned from the best teacher a person could ever have that the truest things do not need many words. He wrote that the child might one day be told they had come from nothing. He wrote that it was not true. He wrote that the world would call some places worthless and some people worthless, and that the world was very often wrong about both. And then he wrote the line, the one a dead man had written long ago in a notebook wrapped in oiled cloth, hidden in a hollow bench, in a collapsed shack on a piece of ground the whole town had laughed at. The line that had, on one bitter night, stopped being a theory and become the truest thing anyone in that country had ever set down. What looks dead in summer may be holding winter's fire. He folded the paper, and on the front of it, he wrote the child's name. Just the name. Nothing else. And then he crossed the warm room, and he knelt down again by the hearth, and he put the letter gently into the child's small hands. This is for you, he said, for when you're ready. There's no hurry. The child looked down at the letter, at the name on the front, written in a steady hand by someone who had only just met them and had already decided they were worth writing to. And the child held it against their chest, the way a person holds the last kind thing they think they may ever be given. Except it was not the last. It was the first, the very first of a great many. Outside the dark house, the wind moved across the marsh, slow, then sudden, then slow again, the way it always had, the way it always would. But inside the three thick walls, made of buried summers and a dead man's patience and a boy's worn hands, it was warm, and a child who had been told they came from nothing sat by the fire and held a letter, and began, slowly, to understand that it was not true. That is the thing about warmth. It was never meant to be kept. A wall that holds the heat in for one person alone has missed the whole point of being a wall. The warmth is meant to be passed on, from a dead man to a boy, from a boy to a child, from that child someday to another, on and on, down all the cold years. So perhaps, somewhere, there is a swamp that someone has told you is worthless, a piece of ground, or a piece of yourself, that the laughing world walked right past. Perhaps you were told you came from nothing. Do not believe it. The surface is the least interesting part of any piece of ground, and of any human soul. Beneath the black water, beneath the bent reeds, beneath everything, the world was too busy to look at twice. There may be summers, buried, waiting, holding their fire, waiting only for one stubborn heart to come at last and cut a single brick.